Every time a new census comes out, which shows that basically white British, for example, in London are, reduced in size. Now it's something like 37% roughly.
Yes.
When I was born, it was 97%, 1961. Now, that is what happens all over London now. Ask anyone who comes, they say, where are all the English people? When Blair was in anyway, multiculturalists were quite open about saying, actually the only way this can really work is if indeed we have some restrictions on speech. The women's movement in the West in this country tends to be about the gender pay gap and, and what you might call first world problems.
Yes.
But not about, were they on the street about the grooming gap, the rape gap?
Yeah. Once the jewel in the crown of Western civilization, Britain now finds herself in a miserable condition. Citizens are held into prison for social media posts, the farmers who work night and day to produce much of our food are singled out for a punitive death tax, ethnic minorities receive special treatment by a state that views anything other than a two-tier system as a failure to enact social justice and a threat to so-called community relations. While Donald Trump is remaking America and much of Europe seems on the verge of a similar revolt, why does Britain, of all Western countries, remain the slowest kid in the class? And how might we go about changing that fact? To discuss this and much else, I'm joined by Peter Whittle, the founder and director of the New Culture Forum, Britain's leading culturally conservative think tank, as well as a former member of the London Assembly, where he took part in regular jousts with Mayor Sadiq Khan. And I should say, Peter, you tended to get the better in those exchanges.
Very, very pleased to hear it. I mean, it was the only thing really, Harrison, that was worthwhile about the place. For people who don't know, the London Assembly, it calls itself London's government, but it's not really. It was set up around about the same time as the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Parliament, assemblies, right, what should we call them? But effectively, it's like a scrutinising body. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit like a parliamentary select committee we have in England, a kind of deluxe version of that. And so we're meant to scrutinise the mayor. And the thing is, he's rather small, and it always used to remind me of, do you know Mickey Mouse in The Sorcerer's Apprentice?
I don't, but I got the idea.
Right, well, he's sitting at the top of this very tall sort of stool with his big book, and that's what he used to do, Sadiq Khan. But the whole reason why that sort of thing was important to people like us, I was in UKIP at the time, and then the Brexit Alliance, was that it gives basically smaller parties a great platform.
And he was usually pretty naked before your questioning.
Well, he was, the point about Khan is that he kind of started to sort of respect us in a way. There were two of us. He hated the Tories, but he had no respect for them. But in an odd way, he kind of grew to, I think, actually, have some kind of respect for us.
Really?
Yeah, because we took the whole procedure very seriously. We played the game. I mean, he's a disastrous mayor. There's no question about it. I'm talking purely procedurally now. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, it was sort of quite a successful time. It was 5 years we were there. But, I mean, essentially, it's one of those bits of government that probably doesn't even need to be there. I don't think we need a mayor now particularly. I certainly don't think we need an assembly.
So speaking of London, it's a fairly unlivable place these days. You've actually made a documentary for the New Culture Forum about this called A London Lost. Presumably that is now why you live 20 miles, which is it west or east? I think it's west, isn't it?
West, yes.
In Windsor, which is where we're filming today. Does it puzzle you the way in which the English have effectively surrendered their capital city without a fight?
It doesn't puzzle me, it depresses me. When you say puzzled, I don't mean to be too pedantic here. I understand why it's happened, in the sense that there's been this narrative, indeed it has a mantra, which is diversity is our strength. And if you go against that, well, woe betide you if you do. It has become this kind of unthinking slogan. So the way in which the trouble you could get into by, if you like, criticising what's happened in London or indeed in the country, is for most people not worth the trouble, and so they live with it. I think in the case of London, what really dismays me about it, and I'm a born and bred Londoner, you're quite right, I left 3.5 years ago now. I still work there, but is that it effectively stopped being my city. Very, very common sentiment. It puts you beyond the pale in the current kind of London ethos. But I found that basically it's a gradual thing, of course. But every time it happens, every time a new census comes out which shows that basically white British, for example, in London are, reduced in size. Now it's something like 37% roughly.
Yes.
When I was born, it was 97%, 1961. And as recently, I think, as 1991, it was 87%.
Yes.
And it's a gradual thing. But when it does happen, we're sort of meant to think that somehow this is something to be welcomed, that this is an improvement on a terrible situation. And I resent that a lot. I think it was around about 2011 where I think London for the first time dropped below white British, was around about 49%.
Sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. And it was on page 6 of the Evening Standard.
Right.
The Evening Standard is London's main paper. It's barely hanging on now, but then it was the paper that you bought. And it was on page 6. And the whole point was, well, this is fantastic, isn't it? And I think that it has changed London for the worse. And I think it has made it a different city, an entirely different city. And I think a lot of the younger people who live there now actually live there almost on a point of principle. I don't talk about those young, woke professional classes who do dominate actually culturally. I think they're almost like they're making a point by being there, and which is that this is how things should be. The rest of the country is ghastly, parochial and racist, and they define themselves against the rest of the country.
There's a strange kind of schizophrenia as well, because you're right. If you're pointing to these demographic realities and these demographic trends in a dispassionate way, then you're allowed to do that. If you're celebrating them, you're not only you're allowed to do that, you're encouraged to do that. Yet when John Cleese comes out and says, I think in around 2018, London is not an English city anymore, and that's why I choose not to live there, because it doesn't feel like home to me anymore. When John Cleese comes out and says that, he's raked over the coals for that kind of statement. Yet presumably a logical extension of London being more diverse is that it is less English. It can't be both more diverse and as English. That's a contradiction in terms. So if you're celebrating it for its diversity, that's not only permissible but encouraged. Yet if you take a negative attitude to it, as you do, as I do, and as John Cleese apparently appears to do, then you're condemned.
Absolutely, and not just John Cleese. There's an actor that maybe many of your viewers will know called Terence Stamp. He's very much from that Michael Caine era.
Yes.
1960s, London born and bred, East End born and bred, said a similar thing. Said no one speaks English anymore, and people came down on him like a ton of bricks in a very rude way as well. Very sort of silly old man, just sort of saying. But it's absolutely undeniable. Can a place be the same with different people in it? And I feel that London has changed in its very soul, actually. It's not actually just about demographics, I might add. That's obviously what we've got to talk about, but also just economically, the way things are very transactional now.
Yes.
But I think really, Harrison, most importantly, which I do think is quite new, is that the story, the backstory of London, if you want, that has been broken, because with the huge numbers of people now who are not from London or not even from Britain in London, they don't know or care about any of the things that have bound it together for years. This is a microcosm of what I think we've discussed quite a lot. I'm sure you have with your other guests, which is, this idea of values. So if you sign up to values, then basically you're fine. It's not about that. It's actually about communal memories.
Yes.
It's about how things developed. It's about the nuance of language. It's about the nuance of behavior. It's about all of those things. It's about a sense as well of basically, if you will, camaraderie, for want of a better expression. Now we've got this thing whereby people just have to sign up to kind of British values. In London, they talk about London's values.
Yeah.
Sadiq Khan talks about London's values. And what are they then? Well, a belief that diversity is our greatest strength, which palpably and obviously it is not. It's also probably your pro-environmental activism. That's another value. And also just essentially, it's very much a public sector equality ethos.
Yes.
And these are now London's values. You sort of sign up to them, you become a Londoner. If you look on the kind of ads on the tube or wherever he puts his ads, you sort of see this, anyone can become a Londoner. Well, they can't actually. If I went and lived in Paris, it would take forever, if probably never, for me to call myself a Parisian.
Yeah.
And so
Much as you might like to identify as one.
well, exactly, yes. However, I might try. It's unlikely to happen. It also wouldn't. I wouldn't do it simply because, it's an arrogant thing to do. And also the odd thing as well is that presumably one is going to this place because you want, the Paris experience. You want French people or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I remember I did one, I'm warming to my subject a bit, I hope you don't mind me going on, but I remember when I was, I'm from southeast London, and I was in Woolwich, which is very near where I grew up, it's the main town, and I was doing a piece about how Woolwich had changed hugely for the Sunday Times, I think it was, and I just asked people around and about on the street. I took the main street, the high street, Power Street, and I thought, right, this is a good, unscientific, but it's a good way of judging how much people feel that they're part of the place. And I just asked them, excuse me, could you tell me where Power Street is? And I think 3 out of 10 people knew, and the other 7 didn't. We were standing in it when I asked them.
Yeah.
We were standing in
Yeah.
it. Now, that is what happens all over London now. Ask anyone who comes, they say, where are all the English people or the British people? And they also, when you ask anyone the way anywhere, nobody seems to know anymore.
Yes.
And this is anecdotal, right? But at the same time, it is, one shouldn't therefore ignore this kind of thing because it's everyday experience. People eventually feel that, well, this doesn't belong to me particularly anymore, and actually, do I even want to be here anymore?
It's also particularly peculiar because one could take a step back and try and consider this ideologically in the way that someone like Eric Kaufman would. So I think Eric Kaufman, who's been on my show on The Forge before, he's coined this term left modernism to describe this fundamental ideological mentality, which in miniature basically says majorities are stuffy, minorities are interesting, they're cultural, they're jazzy, and therefore in the interests of trying to create a cacophony, a kind of vibrant culture, we want to try and make sure that we are pro-diversity and anti-homogeneity, pro-heterogeneity, pro-difference, all these sorts of values. What I find interesting is that people who are left modernists or take that kind of jazzy, multicultural attitude to London and think that London has been improved by this, generally sort of like white middle class people, when they go to Spain and they hear English people being a little bit too rowdy, English expats being a little bit too rowdy and not speaking Spanish, they view that as an offense against local Spanish culture. So they're highly conservative in relation to other cultures, but incredibly entropic in their relationship to their own. I remember being in Malawi once as well, and this sort of Israeli-Argentinian woman who was clearly very left modernist. She clearly thought that, I want Buenos Aires to be an international city. I want Europe to be flooded with immigrants, all this sort of thing. But she felt that the presence of too many white people in rural Malawi was somehow a stain on the authenticity of that local culture. So it's more than just I'm multicultural and in general. Like, they seem to reserve their multicultural attitudes for white majority countries, which to me is proof of a kind of anti-white double standards, which are very intractable for these people.
Oh, no, but without question. I mean, people say it's a multicultural world. No, it's not. It's a multicultural Europe and Anglosphere,
basically.
And essentially, it is the implication behind it, or I think the assumption behind it, is that we've got to, in some ways, be taught a lesson, or somehow we've got to kind of have our prejudices broken down. All of this, and it's helped along, as you say, by those kind of, well, I would call them the lumpen intelligentsia.
It's a good
these
term,
people who essentially, it's pitching it too high to talk about them as being Orwell's intelligentsia. But he talked about the intelligentsia, and the aspiring intellectuals of the middle class as basically pretty much having a distaste for their own culture.
Yes.
He talks about suet puddings. Who knows what a suet pudding is now? I remember them. But suet puddings, and he said they take their opinions from Moscow, and shows how this is 1946, something
around
like
then,
that.
yes.
But I think that the point absolutely remains, and this is very, very sort of strong. So London has to be judged, Britain has to be judged on how diverse it is. Every other place has to stay authentically what it is.
Exactly.
And those people also alienate one about London.
Yeah, that's true.
They do.
Yes.
I mean, when we were doing the Brexit campaign, I was very involved in that. And London, of course, is like being behind enemy lines, or so we thought. But the whole way in which, one would be received by these people and their various institutions was one of kind of hostility, the very most kind of just tolerance. They would tolerate you, especially if you sort of spoke the same language as them, which I broadly did, and I was in the media and all of that. But essentially, they set the tone. It's kind of a little bit like New York, and London was never like New York. It's a bit like New York, which is middle-class liberal, lumpen intelligentsia, whatever, and then increasing ethnic minority population, which is actually very, very conservative.
Yes.
Do you know, I'll tell you one thing very interesting. London prides itself on being, as you say, diverse and the opposite of provincial Britain. London is also the most hostile to the idea of homosexuality, for example.
Yeah.
Now, it was a survey done in 2015, and the people were asked all around the country, do you find being gay morally unacceptable? Not legal or anything, but just morally unacceptable. And the number of people averaged out, I think, at around about 17% in all the different areas of Britain as being, yes, it was unacceptable. I would say that's pretty good going, actually, if it's a small amount, except London.
Yeah.
And it was nearly 30%.
Yeah.
Now, I find this fascinating. I'm not saying it's all Islam or Muslims, actually. It could well be people from very
African
high
history.
Anglican Africans, or it could be even Polish Catholics, for all I know.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, isn't it interesting that, in fact, it's actually becoming more conservative in that way. And you sort of sense it. I think creatively you sense it. London was always a very creative place. Is it really now? I think it's quite arid culturally now, actually. I don't mean in heritage terms.
No.
Heritage terms is just an embarrassment to britches.
Yes.
I mean the current scene.
Exactly. There's nothing cutting edge about us anymore.
Not really cutting edge. I think the last time would have been the 90s, possibly. And actually, we are talking about the 1990s when everything really changed.
Yeah.
You can actually put it down to 1997. But before that, there was this thing called Cool Britannia. I know it's terrible and very sort of, all terribly sort of Blairish and all of that. But you felt that it was actually very lively. Now we have this thing whereby another thing, diversity being our greatest strength, is that diversity in and of itself is a great sort of engine of creativity. Now, our greatest achievements are probably when we were more monocultural.
Yeah.
I think we're living in a very, as I said, arid time. But you might say, well, okay, but you're going back a long way. No, actually. I mean, growing up in London, David Bowie came from Bromley and Brixton, or I think it was one or the other. He lived in both of them. I don't know, Boy George, Kate Bush, all of these great figures, they all came from my area. It's a kind of sensibility, the Kinks, it's a kind of sensibility. I don't see anything like that anymore.
And I suppose, one precondition for culture being interesting is that people need to feel free to practice it. They need to feel free to experiment. And one of the unpredictable downsides of diversity, people have actually lived in diverse countries, which we're increasingly becoming. This becomes obvious, but in the abstract, you might think, oh gosh, the more diverse a place is, the more cacophonous it's going to be, clash of perspectives, this is going to be interesting, heat may generate light, who knows what may come from this. But in fact, what really happens when you have high levels of ethnic, religious, and racial diversity in a given territory is that everyone's terrified of everyone's treading on eggshells because no culture wants to offend another. And so people actually begin to self-censor much more under those arrangements, I would say, than they do under more homogeneous ones.
Yes, I don't think it's like different cultures don't want to offend. We're talking about basically it's one culture that doesn't want to offend.
Right.
And also through fear of the law as well,
yes.
Increasingly.
Yes.
And that is kind of white British, or call it what you want. But essentially that is the situation that we have now. When one talks in these terms, it's always worth remembering that we are talking about quite an extreme situation compared to what I was growing up with. Like London has always had immigrants. Everyone knows that. I mean, of course it has. It's, throughout its history. But the story that is being actually pushed to people now, to the extent that I think everyone believes it, is that it was always an entirely diverse place. Immigration built London. A massive kind of insult to generations of British and English people, actually.
Sadiq Khan has said this explicitly, hasn't he?
Yes, it's sort of basically that London was entirely this, it always has been that, and you're lying if it... No, right? The differences between accepting what I would call a civilized amount of people from around the world, I don't know, 50,000 was the average, I think, in Britain till around about mid-90s, 97. Few people really took exception to that, few people. But that is not what we've experienced over the past 25, 27 years. No. It's just not. No. And also, the culture which has driven it is different.
I started by saying that this constitutes a surrender on the part of the English in their own capital city. And I do find it peculiar how the term appeasement evokes very different feelings in different contexts. So, for example, in a geopolitical context, it's still to this day considered unthinkable that we would do anything like, even so much as saying that you want to negotiate with a foreign power, whether it's Saddam Hussein or Vladimir Putin, you'll instantly be accused of being Neville Chamberlain, you will be dismissed as an appeaser. We still talk tough in this geopolitical context. Yeah. Yet at home, it's very much the done thing to appease particularly imported tribal subcultures, because there is a fear that if you don't do that, then you are either going to be letting down the cause of social justice on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's a more pragmatic concern that community relations will be inflamed if we don't, if we enforce the law without fear or favor with something like the rape gangs, for instance. And so, do you sense that Islamism in particular, in the same way that the argument about appeasement in geopolitical context, usually people will say things like, if you appease Putin, he will give him an inch, he'll take a mile. That's just considered par for the course in foreign policy debates. Do you sense that Islamism domestically is similarly emboldened by this show of weakness on our part?
Oh, without question.
Yes. Go on.
Without question. I think it's a question of pushing as far as you can, seeing how far you can go. Our record has been so lamentable on that. The time really to have made a real stand would have been around the time of the Satanic Verses and Salman Rushdie. But I have to say that people were burning books, not necessarily in London, I would say, but they were around the country. But the attitude of the establishment, not just left, many right-wing academics, we did have them in those days, was outrage that this was happening, and it was terribly offensive and rude.
Excuse me, sorry, an outrage by Salman Rushdie, or who were they offended by? They were offended by Salman Rushdie, or were they offended by
Salman Rushdie and the book? Basically, this was insulting and basically shouldn't have done it. So, in other words, it wasn't a left-right thing, really.
I'm just clarifying. What I mean is that they weren't offended by the tribal reaction on the part of Islamists. They were more offended by by Salman Rushdie.
Yes, exactly. And they didn't. I think people didn't. It was everything was much smaller then. Right. I mean, it's as simple as that. The Muslim population was much smaller.
Indeed.
But they went out and demonstrated and burned books. From that moment on, and that basically, as far as I can see, every time it's happened, every incident that comes up, there is no real pushback, not really. So essentially, now we have a situation of internalized censorship. I mean, in some ways, you don't need new definitions of Islam and all of, because it's all inside people now. They just think, I will not say this. I'm not sure whether I can say this or that, so I'll just be quiet.
Yes.
So I think that it's kind of worked in that way. I mean, I remember, around the time of when Blair was in anyway, multiculturalists were quite open about saying, actually the only way this can really work is if indeed we have some restrictions on speech.
Yeah.
Quite open about it. I say little did they know. Perhaps they did know.
Maybe they did.
What was coming.
Yes. Do you feel that the debate our national conversation in Britain, and I suppose broadening it out in Europe, has advanced at all? Because it occurs to me that we really are living through an interminable and intolerable Groundhog Day in terms of tackling these questions. I mean, it was in the early 2010s that politicians as sort of milquetoast and centre-right, as David Cameron in Britain and Angela Merkel, the former leader of the CDU in Germany, were making open speeches about how multiculturalism had failed. Open speeches.
Oh, 2010, you're quite right.
Exactly. Yeah. And Suella Braverman, former British Home Secretary, repeats this in 2022, 2023, and she's excoriated for the whole thing. Do you think that the national? I don't want to be too blackpilling and pessimistic, but do you think that our national conversation has advanced even the slightest in the last 15 years?
If you stick around enough, right, everything is circular. And it all comes back again and again. And I mean, so in answer to your question, I am being a little bit bleak. When you hear the same things being put forward, the same kind of explanations, and then occasionally something does slightly change. So what we don't have anymore, you don't hear, is that, for example, Islam is a religion of peace.
Yeah.
you don't really hear that from politicians, and unless you've heard it, I don't.
Not recently.
No, but you used to always get this, right? That was one of the cliches you had. Then another cliche was this is a distortion, for example, of what they're saying is a distortion of Islam. Islamism is not the same thing. And so to that extent, there are little improvements, but it's pretty thin gruel
Yes.
on the whole.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose in some ways, you and I have been having this conversation about it 20 years ago? Well, I remember having them, so possibly yes. Would we be recording it? I don't know. I'm not so sure.
Maybe there is just going to be, because one thing that's definitely true is that social media has blown all of this wide open. We're obviously, I'm a fellow at the New Culture Forum, you're the director. We are beneficiaries of this structural transformation of the public sphere that has occurred. I think a lot of the people who set up these companies didn't expect that it would have this impact, but nevertheless it has had that impact. But maybe it's inevitable that there's going to be a slight time lag between the commentariat class, what the commentariat class is willing to say and what our political class has been willing to say. But it seems to, so I would argue that the national debate, insofar as we consider the national debate, whatever occurs on X, Twitter, and whatever occurs on YouTube, probably has advanced a little bit. When you read politicians' speeches, it just doesn't seem like it has at all.
Yes.
Certainly not in Britain, maybe a bit more on the continent. They're talking more about remigration and these sorts of things now, but here in Britain it seems very stagnant.
Yes, exactly. And in some ways we are going in the kind of opposite direction.
Yes.
It's not just that we're an outlier, we're sort of going in an opposite direction. I was reading just today that the Labour Party is going to set up a kind of, in Parliament, I think it's a black caucus, black MPs, I think cross parties.
Yeah.
We also have sectarian Muslim independents, but they've formed a group.
5 of them.
Yes, in
Parliament.
4 and
Corbyn in Parliament, yes.
So that's all very bad. I think that, when you talk about how have things got better or worse, I think of 2 things. When we started the New Culture Forum 2006, for example, we were solidly about culture. I was very affected by what happened 9/11. I was living in America at the time. And it was very much in the air, right? Theo van Gogh had just been murdered. It was very much in the air. And our very first speaker was Melanie Phillips, and she'd just written a book called Londonistan. Point I'm going on to make is that still, most of the commentariat, and indeed politicians, and indeed people who were interested in politics, saw things through an economic prism.
Yes.
And that took a long time to shift. But I've actually seen it happen with people that I know. And they sort of start thinking, actually, it's all very well going on about the economy, but there won't be a bloody country unless we get this sorted.
Exactly. And
so that has been a huge shift. That is good.
Yes.
Very good. The other one as well is that, well, there are blokes like you around. Right? Now you might say, well, weren't there ever? Well, actually, no. I mean, 2006, there were some real great people around, like Douglas Murray and people like Mark Stein at that time. But broadly speaking, you and your contemporaries, people that are now active in our field in different ways, you were like 5 or something, weren't you? Or something.
Yeah, I was.
Or at school. And but you have actually come up and are thinking the things you think and trying to put them into action and influence, having known nothing else. Now, that, therefore, is surely a good thing.
Yes.
That's a good thing.
Yes, that is a good thing. And I think it stems from a very palpable feeling of dispossession. Like I've said on record before, I think I've written this before, that the experience of being a young conservative, small c conservative, whatever that means, by the way, but the small of being young reactionary, whatever you want to call us, is a feeling of being cheated out of an inheritance that was supposed to be yours, but that wasn't handed down to one rightfully as it should have been. Yes, I think that that's partly what explains the overrepresentation, we're not a majority yet, but the overrepresentation of young men in what we might want to call, dissident right or reactionary forms of politics. I think in Britain, a really interesting statistic on this is that Zoomers, so people who were born, I think, roughly between 1996 and 2009, prefer Donald Trump to Nigel Farage. We find Trump more sort of more attentive to issues of civilizational urgency, which is not to say we don't like Farage, we do, but we would vote for Trump over Farage, which is not something you would find among sort of older generations of conservatives who read the Telegraph in this country.
Oh, no, there's a kind of problem with Trump is simply that people have a visceral reaction to him personally.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned there about the young people who would vote for Trump.
Young men, particularly.
Young men, certainly not young women. Young men vote for Trump. The majority of the population, apparently, if you present Trump's policies to them without saying it's Trump, they are for them.
Exactly.
As soon as you say that it's Trump, they
Exactly.
hate it.
Exactly.
And it must be something to do with, he's just, what his manner and all of this.
Exactly.
But I think that I just want to add one thing, actually, if I may, without going off into tangent.
Please.
You talk about things being better. Yes, on that front, better. And then we discuss on the New Culture Forum, like you have as well, about new Islamophobia laws coming in, and you realise that actually, really, we haven't even started. I mean, it is so bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's being sort of accepted. So that is bad. The other thing that distresses me is during that period, and particularly in the past 20 years, is the total demonization of working class people, the white working class people.
Yes.
Total demonization. And the utter contempt with which they are treated and talked about. The way that they were talked about during Brexit, and indeed during the pandemic, actually.
Yep.
And you thought, to the point where you actually thought, I don't recognize this place. But that wasn't the way people behaved before. They didn't say things before. You said, well, you're maybe being too romantic. No, actually, I'm not being. And that, I think, is appalling. And the most recent manifestation of that has been the revelations of the rape gangs and the fact that they were chosen, those girls, for being white and working class. And somehow or other, we lived with it, And it's unspeakable to me. So all of those areas, yes, no question things have deteriorated badly.
Yes, and if people want to read a very sober and instructive account of the way in which the white working classes in Britain are increasingly demonized, they should get a copy of Paul Embry's Despised, which is a very good book on this matter.
There's also a very good one from one of our great friends in the New Culture Forum, which at the time was, it was a big deal, the book called The Likes of Us.
Oh, of course, Michael
Collins.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. He wrote it about 20 years ago, and looking at an area in Elephant and Castle, which is an area in South London.
Yeah.
And, and looking at basically what it amounted to the wiping out of the memory, even, of the people who were originally there.
Yes. Another question I want to ask you. So, I wonder when we do resist mass immigration as a movement, are we often guilty of falling into left liberal minoritarian language? And so I want to make myself as clear as possible here.
Sounds a bit brainy to me.
No, you'll be able to wrap your head around it.
Okay.
I'm sure.
Ooh, it's a relief.
But I've noticed, haven't you? I think probably you have too. And I should say that I don't disagree with this, but people will say things like, we don't want too much Muslim or third world immigration because think of what that might mean for Jewish people, think of what that might mean for gay people, think of what that might mean for women. And, I don't want to see Jewish people mistreated and hunted down in the streets in Britain, or anywhere. I don't want to see gay people mistreated. I don't want to see women mistreated. But it does seem to me that the fact that we are tapping, we almost feel as though our case is only morally legitimate if we can cite some minority interest.
I see, hiding behind them.
Exactly, that might be hurt by this. Whereas it seems to me that it's perfectly humane to notice that not only minorities, who should have full rights under the law in Britain, but majorities have rights and interests. And it rather defeats the point of being a majority and having the critical mass of a majority if you're only allowed to stand up for yourself once you become a minority, and you're less able to stand up for yourself. As Michel Houellebecq in Submission says, or one of the characters does at least, he's having an argument with his Jewish girlfriend as I
have no Israel.
I have no Israel. She's going to go home to Israel because things are getting hairy in Paris, as it's a sort of Islamist government has teamed up with the left. And he says, oh gosh, I don't have an Israel. So it just seemed to me that majorities also have interests, and we would do well not to tap into that minoritarian language so much.
No, I mean, I see what you're saying, but I think one can be both, actually.
Yeah.
I absolutely think that the majority should prevail. I think minorities are used, as a way of chipping away at them. However, if you can actually fear for example, what might happen to women when exposed to hugely different cultural attitudes to them. Certainly, I nearly said as a gay man there, which is the most identitarian thing I could possibly have done, is it not? But it's a fact, you sort of think, well, why would I be possibly welcome this? And what, as a result, one feels is unbelievable frustration that gay lobbyists or whatever, and the feminist movement seems not to actually be that worried about it.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's certainly true.
It's just extraordinary. I mean, with some really valiant and wonderful exceptions.
Indeed.
In the main, the women's movement in the West in this country tends to be about the gender pay gap and, and what you might call first world problems.
Yes.
But not about, were they on the street about the grooming gang, the rape gangs?
Yeah,
were they?
No, they're too interested in the...
And if you want to get gay guys out on the street to protest, have a go at Putin or something, and what's happening with Putin. Nothing about Islam.
Yes.
Nothing about Islam. Nothing about the fact that people are throwing off buildings in Islamic countries, for example.
Yeah.
However, at the same time, I don't believe that by highlighting those things that you're hiding behind. I don't think so. I think that the majority, one has huge faith, in the wisdom of crowds, and in the wisdom of the country. It's put to the test sometimes.
Yes.
But I have a very strong sense of actually people being the backbone of the country. I'm very strong. My parents were.
Yes.
That's my feeling of them, and they were very much of the majority.
Absolutely, and I suppose my concern is more tactical and strategic than moral. Because I completely agree with you. I think it's very legitimate to point to the ways in which these people. I picked my little triad: Jewish people, gay people, and women. Minority interests are going to be harmed by increasing mass immigration into Western countries like Britain and the rest of Europe and North America and Australasia. But I suppose my point is: has the right been somewhat cowardly in leading on these points? And does that not, in tactical and strategic terms, doesn't that mean that we're reinforcing minoritarian ideology a bit? And that we should lead with, we should be a bit bolder and a little less tepid.
Oh, you could be bold when you say the right is being cowardly. I mean, unless I misunderstand you, I think the right has been virtually absent, actually, from these things on the whole. I'm not talking about the kind of, waters in which we swim all the time, think tank world, but I'm talking politically now, politicians. Almost nothing about any of it. I mean, until it's way too late. But I suppose really, I would just reiterate my point there that you do have to fight on certain territories that are open to you, and those ones are certainly open. Those kind of minority. For example, I get tired of hearing people talk about the shocking rise of anti-Semitism in this country as though somehow British people have suddenly decided to become anti-Jewish.
Yeah.
When in fact Jewish people have been an integral part, at least in my life, in growing up, in all the things I like doing in my everyday and the interests I have and all of that. And yet somehow we've suddenly become more, no, it's because we have a massively growing Muslim population.
Yep.
Right? Simple. And in fact, Muslim commentators will say this.
Mehdi Hassan admitted it in an unwise moment of candour in the New Statesman about 15 years ago.
Yes, indeed.
He called it our dirty little secret, is what he said.
Trevor Phillips.
Trevor Phillips has admitted it.
Yes, and said,
not admitted it, but he's, yes.
No, he said, we've got to face these facts, of course. Right.
Yeah.
But I feel that it's actually sort of, it's basically used as a kind of way of insulting the majority of people.
Yeah.
So what is this we?
Yes.
When you see the we in the headline.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose part of the agony of being a conservative-minded person, again, small c, it always has to be emphasised in the British context that we don't care much for the Tory party, nowadays is that the institutions in which we might once have sought refuge from these forms of madness that we're talking about seem equally to be arrayed against us. And I suppose one of those, which I want to touch on with you, Peter, in particular, is the monarchy in Britain. You've written a book before, Why Monarchy Matters.
Monarchy Matters.
Why Monarchy Matters? Monarchy Matters.
Just Monarchy.
Monarchy Matters, sorry, yes. And you're an ardent monarchist, I think it's fair to say, maybe even a royalist. I think we sort of use monarchist and royalist to distinguish between forms of enthusiasm about the royal family. The British monarchy today, and particularly the King Charles III, has for the most part either gone along with or failed to resist what our oligarchic political class has done to us in terms of in facilitating wave of torrents of mass immigration, and then, to add insult to injury, mandating a kind of state-sponsored doctrine of multiculturalism, which necessarily dilutes our own culture. Not trying to be too provocative, but what is the point in having a monarchy if it fails to defend its people in this way?
Well, you may well ask. You may well ask. I think we've discussed this, I think, recently, Harrison,
yes.
But things that the royal family do now, or the king, the queen, things that they do now, which once would have been quite innocuous and, celebratory, until actually quite recent past, now have a particular feel to them, a political dimension, not intentional on their part, I would add. It's just that our society has changed so much, so that when people see them, packing up, little bags of dates because it's the beginning of Ramadan and things like this, once upon a time wouldn't even have remarked on it. Now, if my electronic post bag is anything to go by, people take exception to it. They're taking more and more exception. Why is he not speaking up for us? Well, he sort of does in an official way, but you know what I mean. Far more worrying was that he used the phrase, I believe, a community of communities, which is the absolute essence of multiculturalism.
Yep.
And he didn't, in the end, the king, say, I will be defender of faith. He did actually say defender of the faith in his coronation.
Yeah.
But
we should be clear, it's, obviously for people who might not know, obviously he's head of the Church of England, and Charles is a little bit more pluralist, and he wanted to be called defender of the faiths in general, rather than prioritising the Church of England. Defender
of faiths, yes, but he's meant to be defender of the faith, Church of England. At one point, I believe, there was even talk of another ceremony as well, alongside, in Westminster Abbey, of different faiths, what have you. But that didn't actually happen in the end. But people do relate him very much as a kind of to an admiration for Islam, for example. I think probably he might be well-meaning for what it's worth, but in a way you see that it's partly, what are they to do, you see? What are they to do? They're just carrying on in some ways. I don't think Charles has been hugely different. Mm-hmm. They're just carrying on what the late Queen did. It's just that the country has changed. So as I said, all of these things have, an extraordinary meaning that they didn't have before. I remember at the time of 7/11, which is when the London transport system was bombed.
7/7.
7/7. Yes, 7/7. The Queen went along to hospital to see people, and she made a speech to the doctors and nurses saying, we will not let this change our way of life, which is quite unusual for her to do. And I was wondering, actually, would even that now, to some courtiers and to some advisors, seem like a too exclusive, not inclusive enough? What is our way of life?
Yes, yes.
Now, what is our way of? Then the monarchy is in a real danger, because the one very strong thing that it could do was to unite people. And it did it very effectively in a country which, what can unite us now? Football, maybe? I mean, but in fact, it's becoming more and more difficult. I'm not so sure they would say our way of life now.
No, they might not. Do you think that, I mean, it's almost sounds, we've been so used to a form of procedural constitutional monarchy where the monarch is just there to sign, to cut ribbons and to basically be a sort of ceremonial figurehead. As Roger Scruton, I think, writes in England and Elegy, the monarchy today is a sort of consecrated symbol of the nation. And that's a nice idea, and I like it. But there were times when you had previous monarchs like Queen Victoria or even George III who were just a little bit more interventionist and were willing to, tick off their ministers from time to time.
I think the thing is, you've got to, I think, stick to the 20th century, actually, to be fair. Probably, I think David Starkey, well, you spoke to David Starkey, he would take it from George V onwards, what you might call the real constitutional monarchs. Elizabeth II was a passive monarch, there's no question about it. Was more passive even than her father, I think. But I think that notion of them being kind of the emblem, the personification of the state, but also the emblem of the country's history, that is so important. Never underestimate the importance of symbols. I know this sounds like an old history book, but politicians do come and go, they really do. And it was basic testament to the power of the Queen in that respect. Was a reaction to her last years, where she became this enormous figure, actually. However, I think that, it will get harder and harder to justify that role if you have a monarch who's going to go along with reparations, if you have a monarch who's going to say, we did do things wrong. Please, everywhere around our schools, our culture, our films, our theatre, our books, our art, everything tells us all of these things all the time. Goodness sake, you don't need the monarch doing it too. Yes.
And if you've got the ceremonial head of the state encouraging precisely that kind of pathological altruism and surrender, it's only going to embolden all the worst types of people to take advantage of what we might think is virtue, or they might think is virtue, but which the people waiting in the wings to take advantage will undoubtedly interpret as weakness. It's worth talking about Britain's political situation a little. What did you think of the recent spat between Elon Musk and Nigel Farage over the person of Stephen Yaxley Lennon, Tommy Robinson? And how, if at all, should Farage handle issues like that differently?
He sort of changed. I perceive that Nigel's changed his idea since then, and he was being very dismissive about Tommy Robinson. But I think he seems to have changed and softened it a little bit. I think he might have taken on board the reaction. I don't know whether it was to do with Elon Musk particularly. But no, I think... you want my view on, say, Tommy Robinson?
Yeah, your view on Tommy Robinson and how Farage should position himself relative to Robinson, I suppose.
Oh, I see. I think, I think he's brave, Tommy Robinson. People always have to say, he's not perfect, and people always say these things.
the
And of course, he's not.
clearing, yeah.
Probably, he's his own worst enemy, and whatever. All of that, and I do understand that, but I think that to basically do what he does under such enormous institutional hostility, I think takes an awful lot of courage. But I think it's probably best for him to carry on doing what he does. I don't think that he wants to be part of reform, the CPT. I don't think it's ever arisen.
He said on record he doesn't, I think.
And what is interesting is that people now do talk in more mainstream, insofar as, say, like YouTube channels are mainstream, about him, without having to kind of do this sort of hostile stuff. But we need people to speak out about these problems, and I mean, whichever way they can.
Yes.
And so that's how I feel. I think with Nigel,
who we should say for viewers, you had something of a relationship with him back in the UKIP days, pre-Brexit, just for context. So.
Yeah, yes, of course. He is building something, and I understand the rationale. He's building something which is, like the famous cliche of taking a Ming vase across a very, highly polished floor to the other side being 2029 election. Totally understand that. I would hope that they would be a little more radical reform.
In what respects?
I think that in the immigration, I think in terms of I've said this on the channel before, but this one in, one out net zero migration, I think that they are, if anything, slightly behind the curve now on the way people are thinking. People's thinking has really gone on in leaps and bounds about this. So I think on that front, I was a little bit alarmed as well by his what he said about fact that we mustn't alienate all of Islam, political Islam, because basically we'll come unstuck. Essentially, I think is what it was. Well, what did that amount to? Why?
What's the future you fear?
Well, exactly. I mean, what are you going? You got to oppose this.
Yes. And it's another example of appeasement being rather the done thing at home, but unthinkable abroad. I find this a very peculiar, crude feature of our discourse.
Yeah, I think that, I think basically, on the one hand, reform have got the most extraordinary opportunity, right, to break the sort of status, this is thing we've been living with for ages. Not just a two-party system, but the fact that they all basically have the same rough approach, and
all of our institutions as well.
Yes. All of it, a lot, the whole establishment. If we could, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had such a thing as executive orders in this country, like Trump, where we could just, they've got the most wonderful opportunity to break through that, and and so one does not want. To sort of chip away or whatever. However, I think these things are urgent. I would like more of a sense of urgency.
Yes.
I think that, huge demographic change, the growing influence, which we see in Parliament now, of Islam sectarianism, and then also, a more coherent immigration policy. Those are the things, I can't see why they are not going to bring reform far more support than it has now. I think it will bring them more support, I don't think it's going to damage anything.
Yes.
But I mean, the fact is, here they are, what is it, top of the polls at the moment. That's more than when I was in UKIP. It's miles more than UKIP ever got.
Yes.
And of course, as well, that I would say that Brexit seems like pretty much a minor thing now when you look at what we're faced with.
Yes.
So it's a matter of survival, So I think a bit more urgency.
Yes, it's almost like there's a crown lying in the gutter, and we just and I feel very exercised because I want someone in the optimal position just to realize that all one needs to do is pick it up. And I think that they are being slightly overcautious at the moment and underestimating how much of the country they would be able to bring along with them if they were a bit bolder.
I absolutely that. And also, when you talk about revolts and popular revolts, Brexit and the 18 million people, that was a popular revolt. Never forget, everyone was against you. All these institutions we're talking about now, they were ranged against people, and they still went out and voted, right? They went out, there were moving stories of people going to their local libraries to find out more about the EU and make up their minds. It sounds sort of like corny to say it, but I know it happened, right? People actually took it into their own hands. So we need an even bigger one of those. And the wrath of the people ranged against us will be far greater than it ever was with Brexit, because we're talking about the whole belief system that they've lived their lives by over the past 20, 30, 40 years. But yes, I think people, if you're more radical, you'll get more people along with you.
Well, I, for one, am up for the fight, and I don't doubt that you are too, Peter Whittle.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. It's lovely. Thank you, Harrison.